second.
What is he doing?
PD cam is back.
It is on body camera and video.
And everybody's watching.
Close calls. Close range. As close as you can get.
Going for the police, bro. I'm sorry.
PD cam on crime and investigation.
On the 7th of June, 19...
Изчезва. Полицията получава достъп до разпечатките от телефона му.
Sharon was out for obliteration. What was that?
Hang on, here we go.
Тя знаеше, че той ще й направи нещо. Не престава, непрекъснато го вижда.
Това е наистина красиво място, където всеки знае всичко за другите. Израснах тук и си мислех, че познавам хората. Но се оказва, че всъщност не познавам никого.
Подобни случаи създават новините. Хората бяха оплашени.
Превъртях отново.
Кръвта е навсякъде.
Никога не съм се питала какво се случва в главата на един убиец, докато не ме засегна лично. Нов сезон на убийство в Средния Запад. От 10 януари по ID.
Кошмарни съседи.
That guy there, he molested me when I was 11 years old.
You were being essentially groomed by a master pedophile. That she had been broken, that she had been coerced into a set of behaviors that gave him complete control. People literally are losing their lives, their hopes and dreams, and their families over this.
Pane, vy jste zhatý. Mijn maakt startbetie, dan heb ik zo'n beest. Je zou met de zelfs voor wat je. En ik bepraat moest wel wanneer dan is de zhatý. Waar je manka, niet met een zo goed. Het een jong je. Je hebt de praat politiek te spreken, zo politiek dat. Je hebt met dat. Je nou zeker te gedaan.
This great estate is home to what has only recently become one of the most iconic buildings in the world, the Collegiate Church of St. Matthew, Roslin Chapel. It took almost 6 centuries for Roslin to make its mark, and then only when American author Dan Brown put the chapel at the center of his blockbuster, The Da Vinci Code. Brown's The Da Vinci Code was released in 2003, and over the following decade, it not only sold in excess of 80 million copies and inspired a Hollywood blockbuster, it helped ensure the long-term security of a small, relatively obscure and somewhat dilapidated 15th century chapel in the Scottish Lothians. For an ancient place of worship, whose worldwide renown is surely the envy of giant cathedrals in faraway lands, Roslin Chapel is of surprisingly modest dimensions. Initiated in 1446 by the third Prince of Orkney, William St. Clair, its construction proved a mammoth task, spread over decades and beyond the Earl's own considerable lifespan. The chapel has been owned by the St. Clair family for almost 600 years. Art historian Lady Helen Roslin is the wife of the present Earl, Peter Sinclair Erskine.
Well, it's rather lovely to think that it was my husband's family who actually built this chapel in the 15th century, which is extraordinary, and it's been in the family ever since, which is rather nice. So it was built by this man over here, Sir William St. Clair, in 1446. And I think really the inspiration must have been that he'd been travelling in France, where there are a lot of cathedrals in this very Roman Gothic style. So he must have come back really inspired to build his own chapel. But I think, for me, being an art historian, you're always interested in the story behind places and what it tells you about the history. And I think that's what's so wonderful about this building. It's got a story all of its own, a narrative. When you step inside it, you really feel as if you're stepping into the Middle Ages. It's like stepping into medieval carving, really.
During an age when life expectancy was just 35 years, William died in 1484 at the ripe old age of 74, leaving unfinished his beloved chapel. It's thought that its original design was for a larger cruciform-shaped building.
This is just the end of what was going to be a bigger cruciform building. During the conservation, our architect took me over to Glasgow Cathedral to have a look at it, because he said, you will be amazed. And he was right, because the choir at Glasgow Cathedral is exactly the same layout as here. Obviously, at Glasgow Cathedral it's much larger because the whole building was built as planned. And here we just put the choir. But it does suggest that this was very much a format, a layout for this kind of building.
Symbologist and author of the Rosslyn Matrix and the Rosslyn Templar, Ashley Cowie, has spent years researching Rosslyn Chapel.
Yeah, indeed, it was meant to be disturbed around another 20 metres to the west. The largest part of the church was never built. If you can imagine, it was a cruciform church, so it was built like a cross. What exists today is the head of the cross. So what I always say is, you know, this is meant to represent man on earth, the cross, or Christ on the cross. All that's been built is Jesus' head. His body and arms were never completed.
I think it's probably just as well he didn't finish it, to be honest. This actually is a perfect size for a family chapel, after all.
Despite its humble size, the chapel was a remarkable accomplishment, and one that drew craftsmen from across the land to accommodation purposely built for them by the Earl in the tiny village of Rosslyn, which is situated less than a quarter of a mile from the chapel and just a few short miles from Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. The result is an architectural triumph whose survival, despite centuries of disuse, is a testament to the quality of its construction. Before Lady Helen became part of the Rosslyn dynasty, she studied art history at Oxford University before securing a job with international auction house Christie's. And it was there that she first came across Rosslyn Chapel.
What was really interesting to me, when I was working at Christie's, I kept coming across paintings and drawings of this tiny place, and it was Rosslyn. And considering how small it is, it was extraordinary how many people had painted it. And I think what had happened is that because quite a long time it was lying abandoned, so it was so beautiful and so picturesque, and it was overtaken by ferns, and there were plants growing up everywhere. So I think it really appealed to the romantic sensibilities.
Although intricate carvings abound throughout the chapel, it exhibits a remarkable absence of design planning. This gives it a sense of complex spontaneity that draws visitors back time and again to make their own new discoveries among literally thousands of figures and scenes cut in stone. Pillars, beams, walls, floors, vaulted arches, roof lintels, and everything else involved in holding up a 15th century house of worship, 68 feet 9 inches long and 42 foot 7 inches high, are literally covered in carvings, big and small.
What's extraordinary is the places sometimes you find the most delicate, intricate carvings. I mean, there's a keystone right up there in the roof that is so beautifully carved, and of course we can't even see it from down here with the naked eye. I saw it during the conservation when I was up on the scaffolding, and they've even engraved the fingernails. It's so delicate. So some of the rougher carving is down on this level. And I think there was a sense in the 15th century that the nearer you got to God, the harder you needed to work to make your carving special.
If there is a common thread running through the carvings, it's one of enigma. Freemason symbols in a Catholic chapel that survived the destructive Reformation. There's an angel playing bagpipes. There's what appears to be an elephant. How many people in Scotland in the 1400s would have even heard of, let alone seen, an elephant? There's a farmer's wife rescuing a goose from the jaws of a fox, a knight on horseback, and a rope-bound Lucifer hanging upside down. There's a Star of Bethlehem shining over Christ's nativity scene, and at least 100 green man pagan faces pulling the oddest of expressions. There's also maize and corn, carved a century before Columbus discovered America, the only land where maize and corn existed at the time. Perhaps the most striking carving, and certainly the most discussed, is the apprentice pillar, a stunning.
Apparently, when he came to the last pillar in the chapel, he wanted to make it really special. So he decided to go off to Rome to do a bit of field work and get some inspiration. And while he was away, his apprentice had a dream, and he saw this wonderful pillar with a wreath of foliage wrapped around it, and he created it. And when his master came back, rather than being pleased with his apprentice's work, he was so angry and so jealous that he killed him on the spot. And what's rather lovely is that the heads of the apprentice and the master mason and the grieving mother of the apprentice are all carved in the chapel. So the masons wanted to record this story in stone.
I've seen many, many pillars, many cathedrals around the world, and I've never seen anything so ornate as that. Now, what's the most beautiful thing about it is it's not been done with modern tools. It's done with eye, the perspective, the ratio, the design, the proportion, all by how it looks. If you look at that pillar, it's almost like it's been computer crafted. It is craft skills beyond anything else that exists in Scotland. That's for sure.
As author of Rosslyn Chapel Decoded, John Rech explains that Scotland's greatest poet may have had something to do with the Apprentice Tale.
It was never called the Apprentice Pillar until Robert Burns visited Rosslyn and gave Meg Wilson, who was the landlady there, a story. So it was really one of the first sort of tourist spins ever.
I'll tell you about the pillar itself. People wearing the Holy Grails under there. People see the head of John the Baptist is under there. I've been involved in scans of that pillar. There is nothing inside that pillar. The beauty and the mystery and the secret and the true knowledge of the ancients is on the outside of the plain sight.
Facts being manipulated to shore up a questionable story that is impossible to prove or disprove. This is the recurring theme of Rosslyn Chapel, whose story is filled with a peculiar collection of puzzling tales. The chapel was built as a place of worship for the Sinclair family, who had built a castle on Rosslyn Estate in 1504. The castle, as well as being a place of defense, was a scriptorium, literally meaning a place for writing. Manuscript writing was a laborious process that could damage one's health, one prior complained in the 10th century. In 1452, a fire in the castle consumed many priceless literary works. Historical documents recount that during the fire, the Earl was in consternation as he raced from his bed to try and save his valuable manuscripts.
There's a famous legend where he had three ladies in waiting and his wife. He raced past them through the fire to get to the books, and he threw 2 chests out the window as his servants were escorting his family out. So there were some seriously valuable papers and books, and could they be under the church? Yes, indeed they could. However, I like to think they're underneath the castle. That's where the scriptorium was.
I think that was what was thought, that it was the castle and there was a fire at the castle. And the books were saved, but I don't know where they've gone now. That may be the treasure. And there are all sorts of ideas.
For a building steeped in the turbulent history of Scotland ever since it was first constructed, it comes as no surprise that royal visitors came a-calling. One royal visit in 1546 by Mary of Guise, wife of King James V and mother to the child who would become Mary, Queen of Scots, is inspiration for yet more fevered speculation about the chapel somehow being more than the sum of its pretty parts. Following Mary's visit, she graced her host, William St. Clair, with a letter of thanks that included one enigmatic line, whose interpretation has been the source of countless theories. She wrote, "We bind us and oblige us to the said Sir William, and shall be a loyal and true mistress to him. His counsel and his secret shown to us, we shall keep secret."
What I was shown to her was important enough for her to actually say this to him and to actually write to him. And the way the letter is couched, it's almost reverential. I mean, this is one of the most powerful royal ladies in history.
I truly believe myself that the knowledge that was given to Mary of Guise was knowledge over where Rosalind was located. There was an enormous push at that time to get to the New World, to get to America. The Norse Vikings, or the Norse navigators, the heritage of the Singlers who were from Norway, were navigators and navigating over to the eastern seaboard of America from the 10th century. I believe that there's a map, certainly a carved chart in the crypt of Rosslyn Chapel. And using that chart, you can teach a navigator how to sail to the eastern seaboard of America and back again using a prime meridian. Now, the temptation is to talk about the rose line that appeared in the Da Vinci Code. He took that from a navigational line. You look at every nation in the world, they all have a prime meridian to measure the landscapes, to create charts from. Nobody yet has asked the question, where's Scotland's prime meridian? I believe he showed her a map, told her about the prime meridian that goes from Rosslyn Chapel, right over Arthur's Seat, to the St. Clair Castles and the fortification in Orkney, covering the longest piece of landmass in our nation. And with that knowledge, with a way to zero and calibrate your sea compasses, I think he passed on to the Stuart dynasty a way of sailing into that big unknown west and coming home again.
Whatever the secret, the chapel has been the academic domain. But that was to change in 2003, when author Dan Brown penned the Da Vinci Code and overnight put Rosslyn Chapel on the world map.
Well, it's been a really big moment in chapel history, actually. It's had a huge impact for us. And it's really sort of put us on the map. And it was really good timing for us because, as I say, when I first came here, I knew that something needed to be done. And of course, what it's done is it's brought the chapel out there so that people know about it. Many more people come now than they ever did before. And of course, everybody who comes helps in its upkeep. So really, it's been a very good thing.
I think he's been very good for the chapel. I have no problem with Dan Brown. I think he's a novelist. He tells a great tale. No, I have no problem with Dan Brown, and it's brought my home village and the chapel in my home village a lot of work for local people, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I think Dan Brown's research and the books that he tapped into to compose the Da Vinci Code story, there's a lot of controversy as he wrote these books for years, and he's taken the best of the worst and best criticised books, put them all together into a genius piece of work.
It's just another example of how it's been an inspiration to writers, poets, painters, whatever. But I always think it's rather nice in the chapel's long history because it goes in cycles. And about 200 years before Dan Brown wrote his book, Sir Walter Scott wrote a book which had the same sort of effect at the beginning of the 19th century. So, you know, it goes in waves.
It got so busy that it became unhandleable. I mean, I've been in the chapel when at the height of the Dan Brown thing, and there was over 1,000 people coming in an afternoon. I mean, I've been elbowed in the ribs, pushed out of the way by small Spanish ladies wondering what I was looking at, because I was spending too much time looking at something through an eyeglass.
When I was there 12 years ago, 15 years ago for the first time, there was a river running through Roslin. The doors were hanging off. It was virtually on its knees. People just weren't going in there. And so where would Roslin be today if it wasn't for Dan Brown? It could be on its last legs. Certainly was heading that way.
Conspiracy theories involving a holy grail embodied by a beautiful descendant of the marriage between Christ and Mary Magdalene was the thread that ran through Dan Brown's best-selling book.
To say that Jesus Christ was married and had a seed and that exists today, I've done some maths on this thing with the clan Sinclair over the last few years, and if that was the case, working with 2.4 children per generation, there's 21.5 million relations of Jesus Christ alive today.
The book and the film went global and brought people to Roslin in their hundreds of thousands, which in turn enabled the Roslins to carry out major restoration. Although the restoration had begun before the film's release, it went into overdrive the moment Tom Hanks and Audrey Tautou walked into the sacristy at Roslin Chapel. In 1995, reports confirmed that damage was being caused to the church by incoming water and high humidity. In March 1997, a freestanding steel structure was erected to cover the chapel in an effort to help the stonework dry out naturally. At this point, external stonework and windows began to be worked on. Over the 16 years of restoration and conservation, thousands of man-hours was worked by scores of teams. The cost of the stonework, stained glass window conservation, the organ restoration, landscaping, and designing the building of the Visitors Centre came in at a staggering £12.5 million. In the summer of 2013, the project was complete. And for the first time since the conservation, our cameras were allowed to feast on the chapel's splendor, filming images not seen in such detail for well over 100 years. Nick Boys was the stonemason who led the conservation.
Just very recently, as we're coming to the end of our project and we've got rid of the scaffolding, we're reminded of just how beautiful the building is. You know, it's once again standing in its own silhouette, you know, standing in its own space. It's not being overlooked by anything. And, you know, it's a real joy to be able to see that again.
The window portals were built into the chapel in the 15th century. The glass was not added until much later. In 1736, Sir James Sinclair glazed the windows with plain glass. In 1869, the 4th Earl of Roslin added the first stained glass. And in 1954, more stained glass was added. Mark Vanbrugh and his team were tasked with the delicate job of restoring all 32 of them.
This is more of a conservation than a restoration. There are elements of restoration in that we're bringing back detail, legibility to the windows, but the vast majority of the windows are being conserved. The sense of daylight that must have been pouring through that building would have been extreme, because it must be remembered that the original building had no stained glass. The school of thought is that they probably ran out of money, but the fabric of the building was designed to contain stained glass. All the details, all the masonry details exist within all the openings to put in stained glass windows. Imagine the building without stained glass. It would look very, very different. You have a very different experience. It needs that sense of gloom within the building to create the sense of atmosphere, and the windows do that beautifully. One of the areas of research I've been most involved with has been the east window. But what I find very, very interesting is that the scheme, the whole glazing scheme within Rosslyn Chapel is fairly standard. It follows traditional high church arrangements. You have saints with canopies. You have subject matters with canopies. These are all very traditional high church Gothic revival styles. But what you have in the east window is very, very different in its iconographic form. It portrays the visitation of the tomb, the idea of Christ coming from the tomb. But what's more interesting is that the main subject within this east window isn't Christ rising from the tomb, it's the three Marys. And the central image of the three Marys is Mary Magdalene.
When we first came here, I came here about 30 years ago before we were married, and there was water running down the walls, and the ceiling was completely green with moss. So, you know, you did feel that this poor building needed to be looked after. So it's been a long project, but I think we've got there. So there is a huge love for the building and a huge sense that we've got to hand it on to the next generation so that a whole lot of new people can be inspired by it.
I just want to take a look at the architecture and learn a little bit about the history. I don't know anything about it, so I'm kind of coming into it without a lot of knowledge going into it, so just kind of hoping to get the feel for it when I'm inside. Well, I read the Da Vinci Code and saw the movie, so I just wanted to see it in person.
I haven't read the Da Vinci Code. I know it's part of the Da Vinci Code book, but I have not read them. That's the only place I've heard of it. I think it'll be interesting to hear what's in there and just find out more information.
Most of what I know about it is from Da Vinci Code, the Holy Grail, that sort of thing. So Freemasons, yeah.
While it helped ensure Roslyn's financial security for decades to come, Dan Brown's fanciful tale sent the conspiracy theorists into overdrive. Stories based on shaky snippets of mismatched facts bent, cajoled, and blended together to fashion a suitably bizarre narrative that captured the fevered imaginations of millions of escapist adventure fans. Central to the Da Vinci Code is the theory that the Knights Templar, an organization set up in 1120 in Jerusalem to protect pilgrim routes to the Holy Land, brought to Rosslyn Chapel a treasure of unimaginable distinction. Lost religious scrolls from the time of Christ, a piece of the Holy Rood, the cross upon which Christ perished, or even Christ's embalmed head, are just a few of the things said to have been safely secreted by the Knights Templar 7 centuries ago within a secret chamber in Rosslyn Chapel. The Knights were war machines turned financial wheeler dealers who bent the rules of their Christian faith to make vast fortunes from money lending. Christian European rulers paid handsome homage to the Knights Templar in the form of money and prime land holdings. But did that include the St. Clairs? And were the Knights Templar ever at Roslin Chapel?
Well, who knows? And it's very difficult to tell about all these things, isn't it? There are certain theories that they were, and that there are links between the Sinclair family and the Knights Templars. And there are certain theories that the Knights Templars' treasure is here. But as I say, I think the important thing is preserving the building and preserving the mysteries and the myths.
The Knights Templars' main logo, their symbol was 2 knights and 1 horse. 2 knights and 1 horse represented poverty of the Knights Templars. So historians come along post Da Vinci Code and they see 2 characters of 1 horse. Well, what else is it? It's a Knights Templar logo. It's Queen Margaret taken back to Scotland by William Sinclair. It's a child on the back of a horse with a cross. Now, we know in history that in the 11th century, Queen Margaret was escorted back to Edinburgh by William Sinclair of Roslin. She gave them the estates, the barony of Roslin in return. What did she bring with her? A part of the cross of Christ, the Holy Rood.
So what of the legend of the 12 Knights Templar buried in their full armour underneath the chapel floor? Ever ready for the moment they must rise to defend the hidden treasure of Roslin Chapel?
There are certainly probably knights down there in their armour, but of course don't forget that Scottish families would have buried their own members of their family under there, so they may well be Scottish knights. They may well be Scottish Sinclair knights.
There were most definitely knights under Roslin. There were 20, I think Sir Walter Scott talked about the knights in their armour with all of the weaponry around them. Now there's lots of historical evidence to suggest that they were there. What's wrong with a Scotch knight? That's what was underneath Roslin in my eyes. And I kind of think the Knights Templars undermine the Scottish knight system and that whole thing. It kind of gets rid of the glory that somebody's achieved in real terms, fighting for Scotland in the wars of independence with England.
Every time I look, I see another face that's, it looks as if you're almost seeing different things. And of course, there's so many ways to interpret.
Ian Gardner is the director of Roslin Chapel.
Of course, the acoustics are great. They really lend themselves to recitals and concerts. And we've got a group coming in from Heriot Watt University to sing for us. So I think that will sound great in such a good circle.
Yes.
For decades, art history scholar Lady